Story 1. It was around 11 p.m. when I finally left the office after finishing up a long day of work. As I walked to my car in the nearly empty parking lot, I let out an exhausted sigh, eager to get home as soon as possible. It was about a 50-minute drive from the city back to my house in the quiet suburbs. I'd always enjoyed the peaceful solo drives at the end of the busy work day. It was a nice way to decompress and mentally prepare for the next day. The roads were usually pretty deserted this late at night, once I got outside the bustling downtown area. I pulled out of the parking garage and began the familiar route I'd been taking home for years now. The highway out of the city was lined with bright street lamps and signs. But soon, I turned down the exit that led to darker, narrower roads surrounded by dense forest. There were never many other cars at this time of night on these back roads. And since there were no neighborhoods or businesses, it was just me, my headlights cutting through the darkness, and the hushed woodland on either side. As I got closer to home, the road narrowed even further into a single lane each way. This last stretch was the creepiest part of my drive since it was so poorly lit. The street lamps were spaced far apart and were rather dim. And when the weather was foggy, as it often was at night here, visibility could be extremely limited. The white mist hung heavy among the trees, reducing sight distance to just a few feet in every direction. For anyone not used to driving this road, the fog could be disorienting. But I wasn't too bothered by the dense fog most nights. I knew there were no turns or intersections for the last few miles. As long as I stayed in my lane, the lack of visibility wasn't an issue. Still, I always drove with extra care on the foggy nights. Just like most other nights, I was cruising along slowly but surely down the fog-blanketed road. Suddenly, up in the distance, I spotted a small blinking light through the mist. As I got closer, I realized it was off to the right side of the road. I slowed my speed to about 15 or 20 miles per hour, trying to judge how close the blinking light was. But before I could get a clear look, it went out completely, leaving me with no sense of where it originated. Out of the darkness, the shape of a small car appeared right in front of me. I slammed my brakes, but it was too late. My car lightly tapped the other vehicle's rear bumper. My heart raced as I processed what had just happened. The other driver clearly pulled out of the shoulder directly in front of me. I sat there in shock for a moment, then put my car in park and slowly got out. Inspecting the damage, I saw there was only a slight scuff on each of our bumpers. Relieved it was minor, I stood by my car to talk to the other driver, who was still sitting inside. Through their rear window, I could see some movement in the front seats. After a minute or so, the driver's side door opened. A man who looked to be in his 45s emerged. He was tall with grey hair and stubble. As he walked toward me, I noticed he had a large build. "Is everything okay?" "You pulled out really quick," I said, still confused by the abrupt maneuver. The man looked around slowly, avoiding eye contact with me. "Yeah, sorry," he finally muttered in a gruff voice. His behavior was odd and putting me on edge. Not wanting to linger, I told him there didn't seem to be any real damage and that I was going to get going. As I reached to open my car door, he spoke up. "Wait, let me check my car to make sure there's no damage before you take off," he said sternly. Though it seemed unnecessary, I reluctantly agreed and stood by while he inspected his bumper. But then he started walking all around his car, apparently checking every inch of it. The whole thing was bizarre given we'd barely made contact. As he moved toward the passenger side, I looked back and saw the shadowy figure of another man getting out of the back seat. My adrenaline surged, and I quickly got back into my car, locking the doors. The two men began waving their arms for me to stop as I put the car in drive and sped off down the road. Looking back, I could see their headlights turn on and shine through the fog. The lights remained visible for about 20 seconds before disappearing from view. I drove straight to a gas station about 5 minutes from my house. I decided to wait there for 20 minutes, just to be sure the men didn't somehow follow me. The old car never drove by. My heart was still pounding, but I eventually continued the short distance home. I didn't end up calling the police that night. In hindsight, the incident was extremely suspicious. But in the moment, I wasn't sure if I was overanalyzing things. I still have no idea what those men wanted from me. If I had stayed, I fear something dangerous or criminal would have happened once it was just us on that desolate road. It terrifies me to imagine what twisted plan they might have had once they lured me into their trap. Maybe I should have reported it in case they tried preying on someone else. I'll never really know what dark intentions they harbored that night. But the memory of those shadowy figures waving desperately through the fog will continue to haunt me. I'm grateful I escaped unharmed down that mist-shrouded road before we found out. Still, I wonder about the sinister secrets hiding in the darkness that my headlights couldn't illuminate. What evil was concealed by the enveloping fog? Story 2. As a truck driver, I was used to long hauls and overnight stays on the road. The trucking company I worked for delivered frozen goods all across the Midwest. Most of my routes allowed me to make my deliveries and return home the same day. But occasionally, I'd have an extra long run that required staying somewhere on the road before heading back. I didn't mind the overnight trips too much. I'd just pull into a truck stop, recline my seat, and get a few hours of rest before continuing my journey at sunrise. It was all part of the job when you're out on the open road for days at a time. You learn to sleep wherever you can. One chilly October morning, I was assigned an overnight delivery route. My last stop was scheduled to bring me about 8 hours from home. I packed a small duffel bag, grabbed a coffee, and headed out before dawn. The drive to make my deliveries was uneventful. I drove for nearly 10 hours before reaching my last destination as the sun began to set. I unloaded the pallets of frozen chicken, signed the paperwork, and started the long haul back. It was around 1 a.m. when I merged onto the freeway headed home. I had about another 6 hours to go, but decided I'd pull over soon to get a little rest before continuing. I was fairly certain there was a truck stop about 40 miles up the road. Driving these desolate highways so late at night can put you in a dazed, trance-like state. With the radio softly playing classic rock and the painted lines on the open road whizzing beneath my tires, I often found myself lost in thought. My mind began to wander as I stared blankly ahead into the darkness. Suddenly, something in my side mirror grabbed my attention. Two bright headlights were shining directly behind the trailer. Yet when I glanced into the rearview mirror, I saw only blackness. This probably meant a vehicle was tailgating extremely close behind me, in that blind spot area not visible from the cab. I tapped my brakes to flash my lights, signaling for them to pass. But instead, they stayed inches from my rear bumper as we continued down the empty freeway. Now I was concerned. If I had to stop suddenly for any reason, I knew this driver was going to rear-end me. I checked my upcoming exits, seeing I still had about 15 miles before I could pull off to the truck stop and get away from this car. The minutes crawled by painstakingly slow as I white-knuckled the steering wheel, nervous about every car that passed in the oncoming lanes. All it would take was one of them to swing wide and force me to suddenly change lanes. Finally, I saw the glowing sign for the rest area, and I exhaled in relief. But just as I put on my blinker to exit, I glimpsed in the mirror that the unseen car had moved to the right lane, as if preparing to follow me. My nerves spiked higher as I slowly maneuvered the 18-wheeler into the truck stop. The shadowy vehicle trailed dangerously close behind me the whole way. I found an open parking spot and shifted to neutral, waiting to see if the driver would finally pass. Instead, they crept along right on my bumper until stopping inch from our trailer. The car itself was not yet visible to me in the darkness. My apprehension grew as I stepped down from the cab and walked back along the trailer. Peering around the side, I could barely make out an old beat-up sedan parked with its lights off. Before I could react, the car jolted into reverse and sped away into the night. I stood frozen for a moment, heart pounding, until the red glow of taillights faded in the distance. I hurried to double-check all my locks before climbing back into the cab. After a quick survey out the windows revealed no other vehicles, I reclined the seat to try and get some rest. I must have dozed off, because suddenly I jolted awake to a loud bang coming from the trailer. I checked the clock. It was just after 3 a.m. As I sat up, another muffled bang echoed through the truck. Grabbing my pocket knife, I crept between the cab and trailer, silently making my way toward the rear. In the shadows, I could see the outline of someone lurking right up against my cargo doors. Summoning my courage, I shouted out into the night, demanding to know who was back there. The shadowy figure darted away, and seconds later, I heard tires peeling out onto the street. My hands were shaking in the aftermath of the alarming encounter. Inspecting the doors closer, I could see deep scratches around the locks, as if someone had tried forcing them open. But they thankfully held tight, keeping my empty cargo area secured. Still rattled, I got back on the road, this time driving straight home, without stopping again. In hindsight, I assume the man who stalked and followed me must have been looking to break into my trailer and steal cargo. But since I was returning from a delivery, he found nothing inside to take. Nevertheless, the sinister events of that night left me on edge whenever I drove similar routes again. Even now, years later, I occasionally get the creeping sense that an unseen car is tailing close behind in the darkness. It serves as an eerie reminder of the unseen dangers lurking along desolate highways at night. You never know whose sinister eyes may be watching and waiting in the shadows. Story 3. It was a hot summer night when my two friends and I headed into the city for a big concert. We were thrilled to get tickets, even though the venue was in a pretty rough part of town. But we figured with the crowds we'd be safe. Arriving at the outdoor amphitheater, droves of people were tailgating the parking lot before the show. The lively atmosphere reassured me somewhat, though I still felt uneasy being so far from home. We'd found our seats as the opening band took the stage. The energy of the crowd was infectious. Soon, we were on our feet, cheering along to the songs we knew by heart. By the time the headliner came out, we were euphoric. The next few hours flew by in a blur of dancing, singing, and reveling in the contagious excitement. For a while, I forgot all about my earlier worries. But as the final notes rang out, dread crept back in about the journey home. Checking the time, it was already after 10 p.m. The parking lot was bottlenecked, with traffic trying to leave the venue. Bumper-to-bumper vehicles barely crawled along the road away from the amphitheater. We quickly realized it could take hours to escape the gridlock. My friend John suggested looking up alternate routes on his phone. After some searching, he found a way using side streets that looked clear of traffic. Eager to get out of there, we agreed to give it a try. John guided me turn by turn through dark, narrow neighborhood streets. Unlike the bright lights and loveliness after the concert, these residential roads were dim and deserted. An uneasy quietness had settled in for the night. Many of the houses had people lingering outside, on porches, lawns, street corners. I felt their eyes tracking us as we slowly drove past. Back home, nobody would be outside this late. Seeing the groups of figures staring us down made my skin prickle. Have you guys noticed there aren't any other cars around? My friend Tony suddenly remarked. Now that he mentioned it, we seemed to be the only vehicle on these usually busy roads. The further we went, the more ominous the emptiness felt. Sean was focused on the GPS, guiding me through the maze of roads. Take a left up here, and we should hit the highway soon, he instructed. As we turned, I slammed the brakes. A sedan was parked horizontally, blocking the entire street ahead. "What the hell?" Tony exclaimed. My chest tightened, looking at the barricade. I threw the car in reverse and sped backward onto the cross street. Peering down the next road, another parked car came into view, obstructing that one as well. We all looked at each other in dismay. How are we being boxed in like this? My mind raced trying to think of an escape route. Just then, I noticed two men emerging from between the houses and slowly approaching my car. The driver's side window was already cracked, allowing their voices to cut through the quiet night air. "Where are you kids coming from?" one asked in a gruff tone, eyeing each of us suspiciously. My mouth went dry, unable to form any words. The man leaned in closer, his face shadowy and menacing. "I asked where you were headed this late at night," he repeated, more forcefully this time. I stammered that we were just trying to get back to the highway. Nodding, he glanced at his partner, who was now at Tony's window, hands resting on the door handle. Dread washed over me, realizing we were trapped with nowhere to go. My heart pounded when both men suddenly yanked at the doors. Instinct kicked in, and I threw the car in reverse as my friends screamed in panic. The man at my window caught his arm in the partially open glass as I peeled backwards. When I heard his cries of pain, I slammed the gas pedal down in terror. We sped through the dark neighborhoods, following the path back until we reached the post-concert traffic again. Floods of relief rushed through me being around other cars once more. I breathed deeply to stop my shaking while we drove home in stunned silence. Although we escaped unharmed, the encounter left us rattled to the core. We had ventured unaware into very real danger in those unfamiliar streets. Sometimes worlds exist just beyond what you can see, full of evils waiting to emerge from the darkness. I'll never know what malicious intent those men had if they got us out of the car that night. And I don't want to know how much worse it could have been if the doors weren't locked. We made it out alive, but parts of me will always remain trapped in that sinister shadow neighborhood. It taught me to always be alert in unfamiliar places, because you never know what hides in the spaces between light and dark. My carefree trust was shattered. Now I understand that some roads carry secrets and shadows that you might never find your way back from.